This is Red Ice Radio, a beacon of sanity from Northern Europe. RedIceCreations.com.
Welcome everyone, my name is Henrik Palmgren. Thank you for tuning in to the program today, wherever you are around the globe. I hope you're having a good start to the summer. Here in the north, we are having a hot, clear blue sky day, finally, up here in Sverige. If you find our radio program interesting, don't forget to visit RedIceCreations.com. Take the opportunity to listen to more radio programs, in-depth interviews on all kinds of topics with many different people that I think all put together paints a very broad perspective, one that hopefully will enrich your view of life and make you think. Historical, geopolitical, esoteric, occult, philosophical, spiritual, conspiratorial, and you name it kind of material. We have over a year of programs available for you for free on the website. No commercial interruptions, stream or download. Don't forget to subscribe to our RSS feeds or check out our iPhone app. And yes, we are going to move on to an Android app as well, but in the meantime, you can go with your phone to redicemobile.com and see if you can use that site with your mobile device. This is where you can check up with the latest radio programs and our up-to-date news feed. We have a lot of material for you on the website in total for you to explore, and so when you're ready for more, I hope you take the opportunity to subscribe and acquire a membership. We have archives going all the way back to 2006 when we started with our radio program. The Venus transit is coming up, the second closing transit, if you will. The first one was in 2004, now the final here in 2012 occurs on June 5th to the 6th. The last Venus transit this century, so unless you go bionic, upload your consciousness to a computer, or find some other way of cheating death, you won't see another one in this lifetime. The Venus Blueprint, Uncovering the Ancient Science of Sacred Spaces, a new book by Richard Merrick, has been released just in time for this Venus transit event, and today we are going to talk about the significance of Venus. The Venus Blueprint presents evidence that the orbital resonance pattern of Venus was used as a template to design psychoacoustical chambers capable of focusing and controlling entheogenic communion. Richard Merrick is an award-winning pioneer in the high-tech industry, developing sound and language recognition systems, graphics and animation engines, and AI game engines designed to mirror and mimic human behavior. He retired in 2006 to further develop his theory of music perception called harmonic interference theory. In addition to writing several books on the topics related to harmonic science, he has written for Nexus and Caduceus magazines and has spoken as a guest lecturer at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. This is a very interesting program, so stay tuned for more. Welcome to Red Ice Radio. Richard Merrick, great to have you with us here today. Thank you for taking the time coming on the program, talking with us here today.
Hi, Henrik. I'm very pleased to be with you today. This is it's going to be a lot of fun.
I think so too. This sounds very interesting, a new concept, a new idea that I haven't heard about before as much. I mean, I've heard about some of the components attached to it, of course, but the way you've seemed to have brought it together is definitely a new kind of area. So in that way, to kind of lay the background, if you will, for newcomers, both to you and to your work, why don't you just give us a little bit on the background here of the new book, The Venus Blueprint, Richard?
Okay, so The Venus Blueprint is, it presents evidence that the orbital resonance pattern of Venus, the planet, was used as a template, a sort of guide or blueprint to design temples. And the reason that it was used for that was to create a sort of psychoacoustical space or a chamber within which the mind could be focused, and it would, in an effort to control the communion that was taken back then, which was entheogenic or psychoactive plants in ancient times. So that's what the book is really about. It's my discovery of this and chronicling the process of tracing all of this information back to, the very, very beginnings and the very roots of religion and early science.
Obviously, we're going to get into some of the Vedic stuff here today. That seems to be a big part of it. But how long have you been interested in this? And if you want to, you can obviously tie in a little bit about the interference theory work that you've been doing as well, if that's pertinent to the Venus blueprint, Richard.
Sure. Okay. Well, so I guess the underlying message of the book is that there was an ancient science that has been largely lost. It's being reinvented in quantum physics today in a more formal way, but there was an ancient theory that goes all the way back to the Rig Veda and traditions apparently in prehistory that described the world as music in some form, that the planets were playing music, they were resonating in the sky and creating resonant patterns. Life appeared to be resonating into beautiful sacred geometries, and that music itself spoke to us in ways that transcended language and ordinary experience. And so my interest in music began, when I was a child, and sometime around the late 1970s, sometime around try to recall the exact date, but around 1978, I became very interested in trying to understand music perception. That was really the early days of music psychology and cognitive psychology experiments into musical perception, and so I was kind of interested in that at the very beginning. Mm-hmm. What I developed was back then was a theory that was based on waves, that we perceive everything as a patterning of standing waves. Like a standing wave would be, for instance, a guitar string. If you were to pluck that, that's a standing wave. But within that standing wave are all these harmonics, these other harmonic partial waves that form. And I became interested in applying that physics to the idea of music perception. Well, I have a lifelong interest since then in studying resonance and the formation of harmonics. What is it in the physics of vibration that allows a string to have multiple frequencies, harmonic frequencies, form on it? It doesn't just do that by accident. There's a physical process that causes that. Mm-hmm. And so I continued to study the best that I could over the years as I was pursuing my career in technology and digital media and then the internet. And I had some startups, some software startups, and was involved in a lot of multimedia development, so I was becoming familiar with digital audio and speech recognition and that sort of thing. And so when I was fortunate enough to sell my last company and retired a few years ago in 2006. And at that point, I went full-time into studying the physics and developing a theory around music perception. In effect, that's the core of this new book as well. It eventually evolved into this new book. The first book was called Interference, a grand scientific musical theory. The term interference in physics is actually a positive one. We normally think of interference as somehow keeping us from doing something. And in fact, there has been a lot of interference, social interference by the church and religions, over the millennia of, I guess, keeping a lot of this information about how nature organizes itself from, in a musical fashion, from the masses. But the interference that I was referring to with the title was this idea that, sound, for instance, when it hits your eardrum, it's really a very complex collection of all of the waves that are out in the environment. And somehow and this is what I described in my first book, that our ears are built and our brain is built in such a way to decompose those waves and to make sense of them. And it does this instantaneously with the physiological structure of our body. It knows how to decompose these complex interference waves into patterns that are recognizable. And so that first book was about how do you couple those external interference patterns with the patterns that are built into your body, into your auditory system, and into your brain. How do you couple those two? What method, what set of principles would you apply to do that? So the first book, Interference, was developed a series of 34 principles that describe music perception as a pattern matching system between interference patterns in the environment and the interference patterns that are built into your brain. So it really becomes quite interesting to realize very simply that we recognize music, the music that we prefer, and that we recognize is the music that is most closely matches the structure of our body. Sounds sort of, you'd think, okay, we resonate with the music, and the closer it is to the way we're built, the more we like it. This is actually a new idea. It's an idea that is not the accepted idea in cognitive music psychology. The idea there is that everything that we think about music is taught to us, or that we learn in the environment, whatever culture that we're in and regional preferences. But that certainly has an effect, but it's not the whole answer. And it comes, it takes you down a road to where you realize that, well, if we have these sort of musical patterns, these sort of harmonic patterns in our body and our brain, then the theory of evolution, of being entirely based on natural selection and random mutation, is an incomplete theory, that there's something more going on underneath adaptation in the environment, in particular carbon and water resonance, since we're mostly carbon and water, and how those elements interact to create certain geometries. So it predetermines what's possible, just the fact that we're made out of carbon and water.
So, Richard, does this mean that we're individually also, obviously we're different, but so that means that we individually will resonate with different types of music because of the fact that we are unique in that way?
There's things that we have in common, and that's rooted in our DNA, of course, and how it unfolds into the geometry of our body, and so that we have in common. But at the same time, of course, there's variations in the DNA, and that would then change the overall structure only slightly in different areas. And some people are short, some people are tall, some have large craniums, some have small, and there's variation within this basic structure that we all share. And that would suggest, of course, then that we all resonate and have different harmonic qualities. Our body is a resonator. If you look at a cello, for instance, it looks like it has been shaped much like a human body.
That's right. Yeah, they call the guitar the woman, right? The female figure.
Yeah,
so
absolutely. And a lot of people don't really think about this, but in the cellos or the string instruments, you'll have a scroll at the top of the neck, and the cranium, or the head itself, is an enfolded spiral. A lot of people, you just don't. It doesn't typically get mentioned at school, but your head spirals around your ears. Your ears are a manifestation of that cranial spiral, and so it is as if these instruments, these string instruments, have been created to mimic the physiology of the human body.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting. So there are a lot of different components here, obviously, to this. I want to make sure we tie it all in, and you know, when we talk about your theory or you know, what you propose here, basically. What about, we have some other aspects here, sacred art, architecture. These are things that comes along with it as well. Anything you want to mention about that in terms of your interest in those things?
Well, yeah. So let's see if I can tie this in. Ultimately, since we're talking about the spiral of the head, there's this consciousness comes out of that spiral, and perception comes out of that spiral, and the harmonic structure of the body then comes out of that spiral, and so central to consciousness is language, and that's at least the consciousness that we think of as human consciousness. And out of language comes, metaphor and allegory and symbolisms. And so the symbols that we see today and that so many people are fascinated with, and that people like Dan Brown are sort of helping to reveal to the world, that it comes from a very, very old tradition. And these symbols are layers. That's the best way to think of them, is they're layers on top of other layers. And those layers, as you peel them off, they go back to something that was sort of a core premise. The symbols are very tied in with this musical concept that I referred to earlier in the foundation of religion, and that has been passed down through many cultures over a long period of time. Mm. And so this new book, really, I began it in the first book, in Interference. I began to become more and more interested in the history of, our current thoughts about perception and about physics in general, and that led me, of course, back through the Roman Church and back to Pythagoras. That was in the first book. And so really the first book does start with Pythagoras and sort of work its way forward, and spends a lot of time in the Middle Ages in what was going on in the development of music theory at that point. Mm-hmm. This new book, The Venus Blueprint, goes back further. It actually... my interest was trying to trace back the origins of this harmonic science, this interest in musical model for the universe, for the world, to trace it back as far as I could and see if I could find an origin to that, and deduce, what was the first religion in effect, or the first cosmology that led to the first religion. And so that's really what the Venus Blueprint documents, is that voyage back in time to find the beginning. and Rosalind Chapel, it really began with Rosalind Chapel. So Rosalind Chapel, lots been said about it. It's been it was at the end of Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code book, as a place where the bloodline of Jesus was perhaps stored underneath the chapel and hidden somewhere. And it was a fascinating story, but I don't think it's the real story of the chapel. And so as I dug into it further, I was first drawn to some symbols in the chapel that began to give me a clue that this place was really about Venus, about the planet Venus, and about the history of all the goddesses associated with Venus. And the first two, let me just start with my first introduction to Rosalind outside of the Da Vinci Code. Yeah. I saw a press release by Stuart and Tommy Mitchell. They're a couple of musicians and composers in Edinburgh, Scotland. And this press release said that they had found that they called them musical cubes. They were carvings in the arches of the chapel, right in front of what's called the Holy of Holies, the front altar of the chapel, and that these carvings looked like resonance patterns that are called cymatics. Mm-hmm. So a cymatic pattern is when you take a plate or a cup of water and vibrate it at certain frequencies that would produce certain geometries, stable geometries. Again, an interference pattern. And so as I was working on the first book, I saw that press release and said, this is interesting. This is a 15th century chapel in Scotland that has cymatic patterns, resonance patterns carved into it. A, why did they do that? And B, how could they even know about this? Because if you study cymatics, you find out that this was something that Ernst Chladni discovered or made popular in the 18th, 19th century time frame, mm-hmm. and certainly not the 15th century. And that you have other people like Hans Jenny and a few others in the 1950s and 60s beginning to chronicle all these patterns. Well, how could these 15th century Scottish people know about this? And so I began to communicate with Stuart, and he shared some information with me. And one of the interesting things was that there were these angels and dragons carved into the pillars underneath all of these resonance patterns. Mm-hmm. And there were exactly 13 angels, and there were 8 dragons. So the angels were at the top of the pillars, and the dragons were at the bottom of one of the pillars. Well, it so happens that 13 to 8 it immediately recognizes as being a harmonic proportion, or in particular a Fibonacci proportion. And that when you divide 13 by 8, you get 1.625, which is very close to the golden ratio,
right?
Which is 1.618033, so on, infinite number, a constant of nature. It also seemed to suggest that the orbital resonance of the Venus and Earth. Venus goes around the Sun 13 times for every 8 orbits that the Earth makes around the Sun. And during this 13 to 8 orbital resonance, a rose is traced out in the sky. It's a 5-petaled rose figure. And so, in effect, the rose line that is created by Venus and Earth in the sky appears to be the origin of the name Rosalind. It's right. a Scottish variation on the term rose line. Well, the fact that I had been deep in the study of harmonic science in that first book caused me to begin to pay attention to the symbolisms that were in the chapel. And as time went on, I began to believe that, well, maybe the chapel itself was a symbol, not just the carvings in it, but the entire structure.
Mm-hmm. As a combined, it's one symbol with all these elements combined that you're talking about.
Yeah, and in particular, I began to look at the dimensions and the proportions in the chapel of the length and the width and the height and the sort of subchamber, the choir loft area, and the underground sacristy area, and so forth. And I began to find all of these, harmonic numbers and golden ratios in this chapel. And based on what I had learned in my harmonic science studies, I began to pull out some of these old, they're standard acoustical formulas for calculating the speed of sound in air and prime resonant frequencies and all these kind of things. And I began to discover that this chapel was very resonant in a very unique way. It would resonate horizontally and vertically meaning it would propagate sound very well horizontally. But the height of the chapel was in a golden ratio to its horizontal width, and so I learned in my theory that this would damp down. It would in effect kill echoes and reverb inside the chapel when you build it in this way. And so you could have music play, and you would have speech and so forth that would propagate very cleanly throughout this stone chapel, but it would not echo.
Pretty amazing.
Oh, yeah, very amazing. And it was just the beginning of understanding this, what we might call an auditory symbolism. And why would they do that? Other than the practical purposes, it was also seemed associated with all these other carvings and so forth in the chapel. So when I went there for the first time and met Stuart and Tommy and some other people, John Stuart Reed, who's done experiments in the King's Chamber, sonic experiments, met with all of them, and we went through and started studying the chapel based on what we knew at that time. As I took the tour down into the sacristy of the chapel, I was rather amazed to find that this sacristy is where in any Catholic chapel they will put sacred objects.
Ah, right. I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, they would put whatever they might use throughout the year during different rituals and ceremonies. There's nothing in there, but that's what it's used for. And off of that sacristy was a sealed tomb, the crypt, where this was built by the St. Clair family, or the Sinclairs, and so the Sinclair barons would be buried in this crypt, which was sealed off, but you could at least see the sacristy itself. And the thing that was interesting to me is that everything was so balanced, in the acoustics of the upper chapel, but down here in the sacristy, it was very, very reflective and echoey. And I thought, well, maybe that's some sort of an auditory symbol of everlasting life, that it would reverberate. And I didn't really understand why they would do that exactly, but Stuart began to point out some of these etchings that were on the wall of the sacristy. Most of them you could, one looked like a star chart with little pentagram stars and things like that. One large etching was of the Gothic arches, looked like Vesica Piscis, which is what they used to create Gothic arches, traced on the wall. But there was one etching that was particularly mysterious that nobody knew what it was. And I later, when I researched it, I had not found an explanation for it. And it looked like a tower, either an oil derrick or a cell tower or electrical tower, something like that, etched onto the wall. And it was just an enigma. Why would they etch something that would look like that? It had these diagonal struts etched on it. It had this sort of little semicircular cup at the top with what looked to be sort of a zigzaggy tree, coming out the top, and a line that went down through the center as if it were an oil derrick. It was very odd. Had a flat top with the cup on top, and then a little pentagram star over to the left. Very strange. And so that stuck in my mind. And as I went back home after that trip, I began to research it.
Did you take a lot of photos at the time? So you had yeah.
Yes, and so I could trace it out and get it. And I took close-ups, to where I could really look at it in detail. And the detail didn't necessarily help you figure out what it was at all. It was just still an enigma. Mm. And I went through a number of books. illustration books. I was going through all kinds of material at the time. And I found in this one Jainist holy book an illustration of what is known as Mount Meru, which is the sacred mountain of the Hindus, or more primitively, or more properly, ancient Vedics, the Rig Veda. Mount Meru is described as the sacred mountain in the Rig Veda, which is the oldest known holy scripture in the world. So here was this illustration, and it looked very similar to this tower that had been etched onto the wall in this Roman Catholic chapel. And I'm wondering, why would there be a Vedic symbol etched into a Catholic chapel?
Indeed.
Yeah, it just sort of was the... it was like the straw that sort of broke the camel's back. It opened up this door to begin asking the question of, is this chapel really intended as some sort of it is a collegiate chapel, but is it trying to teach us that Christianity is essentially a Vedic, descended from Vedic beliefs and Vedic cosmology? So the more I read the Rig Veda and various, the Upanishads and the appendices and the glosses that had been written about the Rig Veda and other Vedic, the other Vedas, that I began to realize that the Rig Veda is really about Venus. I mean, it seems founded on this fertility concept between the sun and Venus. Mm-hmm. Sun being male, his name Surya. Indra was the sky god, also associated with the sun, and Venus. And in fact, there's two names associated with Venus. One, the most commonly used in the Rig Veda, is Shukra. And that has a particular meaning. It actually means, bright white, or in particular, semen. So it's a fertility. They saw Venus as sort of the seed of the sun. Mm-hmm. And in fact, if you think about it metaphorically, it does reflect the sun, and it does appear to come in between the sun and earth. So it's sort of an intermediary. But there's another name that's associated with the planet, and that's Vena. And so I found some scientific, they were scholarly articles about Vena and about the connection with the Rig Veda. And so the word Vena and Veda and Venus they all share the same root. It seems to go back to this goddess that was controlling the fertility process of the planet between the sun and planet. And there's like Rig Veda 10.123 talks about Vena compelling the sun's light, or the membrane of the light, to fertilize the waters of the earth. And so the more I again got into the symbolism and allegory of the Rig Veda, the more I began to see that some of these symbols used in Roslyn Chapel were at core Vedic symbols, symbols of Vedic cosmology. Huh. Now the Sinclairs have been determined to be Jewish Christians, which are variously called Ebionites. And they were a competing sect to the Nazarenes, and from the best we know, they descended through the Essene Mystery School and connect directly back to the Temple of Jerusalem. A lot of people may know the Knights Templar were the knights of the Temple of Jerusalem, and the protectors or whatever of the temple, right. Temple knowledge, and were descended from those days, at least in legend and the best knowledge we have.
Now, I wanted to just ask you about that as well. We could either talk more about that in detail later, but I did want to ask you like how far or where we take it then, because I mean, as you say, well, what is known today is that the Sinclairs or Sinclair, they built this and they did so allegedly also with the based on the same ground plan as you said here on the third temple at Jerusalem, basically. And there's other people who have found this as well. I'm particularly thinking about someone like Robert Lomas, for instance, who even argue that Freemasonry itself started in at Roslin Chapel, and there is even carvings and proof or evidence for this as well. We can talk more about that in detail, but is this any element at all that you tied into it as well then?
Well, sure. In fact, the inside of the chapel, the basic dimensions of the interior of the chapel is a double square. If you were to take two squares and put them end to end, that's in effect the rectangle that you have in the basic floor plan. That is a very interesting geometry, in that the golden mean is involved in the diagonal of the double square. And anytime the golden mean comes up, well, now you're getting into something that's natural, that is somehow synchronous and resonant with nature. Well, the inner temple of the Temple of Jerusalem, or the Solomon's Temple, as it's called, is a double square as well. But the double square is not the only key to understanding the geometries, the architecture, the floor plan of these structures. There's a larger geometry that double rectangle fits within. Just like many sacred geometries can be overlaid and intersected. You can, for instance, you can get all five of the Platonic solids, the perfect solids, out of what's called Metatron's cube, which is a hexagonal pattern, interference pattern. And so sacred geometries all interconnect. The question, that is often not addressed is, why do they interconnect as they do? What is the underlying reason that they all work together so well? What is the lattice or the structure that binds them together? And that's part of what I talk about in both these books. But to continue to pull that Solomon's Temple together and to integrate it with Roslin Chapel, a lot of people, I will say, they dismiss this connection between the two only because they haven't gone, in my opinion, deep enough to understand the geometry that the two share. And it's not an easy problem to solve. Otherwise, it would be well known. But as I came to find out, this little etching that was in the sacristy was a subset from this same larger geometry shared between these two temples. And that geometry, believe it or not, is the orbital geometry of Venus itself. The rose pattern, the rose line pattern that is created by Venus over an 8-year period in the sky. If you take it and you lay it down, you will find that that within it, of course, it has a series of stars or a series of pentagrams or pentagons that are nested one within the other. Because again, it's sort of I wish I could show a picture to the listeners, but there's a picture in the book, and actually on the very cover of the book, of this geometry. Yeah. And it is in effect a fractal. I mean, it's what we would call a fractal of a pentagram, a star. So that every one of the 5 points of a big star has smaller and smaller stars on it leading up to the point. Well, what I found is that when you lay that down over the floor plan of Roslin Chapel, you get all these alignments. You find that all the dimensions, many of the dimensions in it, the location of, well, first of all, the overall dimensions, both above ground and below ground, will fit within this fractal pattern. And this is the Venus blueprint. That's actually the name I gave it.
Yeah.
But you'll find everything from wall thicknesses to pillar locations. All of these things align within this one overarching geometry. And what I came to find out as once I saw that, I said, well, I wonder if there's some other ancient temples that fit that. In particular, how about Solomon's temple? So I looked at that, and yeah, indeed, if you think about, if anybody out there is familiar with the floor plan that Isaac Newton did of Solomon's temple, based upon the description, in the Bible and the Hebrew Bible as well, that there is this as you get towards the Holy of Holies, the innermost temple, where the feminine presence was, which was called the Shekinah. The rooms become smaller and smaller, and it's in that process that you get to the double rectangle or the double square rectangle part of the floor plan. But then it gets smaller and smaller still inside that. Well, Solomon's temple matched this same orbital geometry of Venus, which just blew my mind.
There you go.
And I looked and said, well, I wonder, how about the Greek Parthenon? And it actually appears to fit as well. And then I looked at the Roman Pantheon. Well, it fit as well. And so the more I looked, the more I found there was other cathedrals in Europe that were similarly constructed, based on this, double square approach and overarching plan. But Rosslyn seemed to be the archetype for it all. It seemed to be the one that most revealed the old Mason knowledge of how to build a sacred space. Well, the story about saying that that Freemasonry was founded in Rosslyn Chapel, I would say is true, but you have to understand that they didn't call it that necessarily, and it certainly wasn't. Yeah. It wasn't organized as we would say Freemasonry is now. I've talked to people, to Masonic researchers who, tend to dismiss the idea that Freemasonry actually started in Rosslyn.
I've heard that too, and it's actually kind of strange to me. But go ahead, Richard. Yeah, it
is. It's very perplexing as to why they would want to disassociate themselves with it, because there's just so much evidence that in some way it definitely did. I mean, there's been claims that William Sinclair was, the first Grand Master of Freemasonry and so forth. Yeah. Well, maybe they didn't exactly call it that. See, that's where you get into this gray area, and certainly there hasn't, at least to the public, not been enough evidence to be able to confirm or deny some of this.
It gets into a technical linguistic kind of argument instead of just looking at the more obvious connections that are actually right there, on the temple and so forth. But as you say, instead, then they've chosen to dismiss this just because of the fact that established or organized Freemasonry officially didn't come together or manifested itself until 1717. So I mean,
yes,
yeah,
yeah. But and then there's the Knights Templar connection.
Yeah,
and there's people. While there are things dedicated to with Knights Templar emblem and actually carved. Those were done in the 19th century. There was a lot of things done in the 19th century to Rosslyn, including putting in the Christian-oriented stained glass. Prior to that, it may not have had any glass at all in the windows, or if it did, it may have been clear. There was the baptistry was put onto the front, which hid. a pyramidal original and sacred geometry original facade to the to Rosslyn.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of things done to sort of hide or to obfuscate the chapel as being anything other than Christian. Of course, and there are Christian-related carvings in the chapel, but of course there's many, many other things that are not, that are really pagan. For instance, there's 103 green men, which are not Christian at all, at least not recognized.
That's right. Yeah.
As being that. But what I found when you actually trace the bloodline of the Sinclairs, you find that it goes up through Charlemagne, and that Charlemagne was descended from the Frankish kings, the Merovingians. So there is Merovingian blood in the Sinclairs,
mm-hmm.
and there's a connection of the Sinclairs to a certain René d'Anjou in southern France. Now, this man was the titular king to the temple to Jerusalem. Okay, he was the king of Jerusalem in title, and he also was related through Charlemagne to the Merovingian blood.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that makes you wonder, well, how could he be the king of Jerusalem if he's related through the Merovingians? Well, there is this historical bloodline tracing that I had to do in the book in order to understand what the connection is to the Temple of Jerusalem. Exactly how did that go back, get from the 15th century all the way back to essentially somewhere close to 1000 BC.
Yeah, because exactly, good point. That's a huge span of time right there.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
If we don't apparently, at least on the surface, what we know right now, have any intermediaries of this preserved knowledge anywhere, that's quite a feat to keep that in somewhere in the line, if you will, done for this long time, yeah?
Yes. Well, the Council of Jerusalem, which was, the people charged with taking care of and preserving the Church of Jerusalem, the Temple of Jerusalem, was essentially the Essene group, or the Essene mystery school. It was through the Essenes that the Council of Jerusalem was maintained. Okay,
mm-hmm.
And the Ebionites were a sect back around the time of Christ, the Messianic period, that were an offshoot or a continuation of this Essene and Council of Jerusalem. They were, if you will, the group that became associated with the Knights Templar, as we know it today, as we know it historically. Mm-hmm. And so it was really through that line that sort of bypassed the entire Christian era, going all the way back to Mosaic law and Solomon and David and that legend and the temple. And so they didn't really see themselves. They didn't see Jesus, for instance, as a Messiah figure. They saw him perhaps as a prophet. I mean, again, not enough written to be able to verify a whole lot, but they didn't follow the Gospels that supported Jesus, for instance, mm-hmm. the Messianic thing. They were more into Thomas and some of the Gnostic Gospels, the things that we would associate with the Dead Sea Scrolls, for instance.
Yeah.
And so that's really where they were coming from. So here's an interesting connection. You've got René d'Anjou, who is the titular king of Jerusalem in southern France. He was also the king of Aragon and had many other royal designations as a result of his bloodline, who is related, through a long line, blood related, to the Sinclairs. Well, there was a Scotsman by the name of Sir Gilbert Hay, who was a friend of the Sinclairs, and ended up becoming, we don't know exactly how, probably through an introduction by Sinclairs to René d'Anjou, and he became Anjou's chamberlain, which in those days was essentially a secretary, and best friend, somebody who really helped d'Anjou. Well, René d'Anjou was then connected to Florence. And at the time, the Medici family had run Florence for a long time. You may be aware that Florence was the beginning or the center of the Renaissance, the European Renaissance.
Birthplace, I guess we could call it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And at that time, one of the Medicis was the Pope in Rome.
Yeah.
It was Cosimo de' Medici. And Cosimo was very, very interested in esoteric knowledge. He, wanted to rediscover the ancient mysteries. And a lot of this was, I believe, being pushed by d'Anjou from France. I mean, southern France had been a real stronghold for the Cathars, which were, again, sort of these they were Gnostic Christians. They weren't necessarily Ebionites, but they were very similar. They probably had some, origin in the, through the Essenes and so forth. Well, so Sir Gilbert Hay then ended up becoming involved with Cosimo Medici, and Medici decided to send out various people, Sir Gilbert Hay being one of them, out into different parts of the world to go and gather up ancient knowledge. This became the medieval Kabbalah, and it was collected into a library in Florence called the San Marco Library, which was founded in 1444. Now compare this with the founding date of Rosslyn Chapel, which is 1446.
Very close, yeah. 2
years later, okay? Well, Sir Gilbert Hay went off into the east. He went to Cathay, so we're talking, Tibet, Naples, and who knows where else. He was gone for 7 years gathering information. And he came back and deposited his findings were in the San Marco Library, along with others that had been sent out into the Middle East and so forth. And there he had access to all of this antiquarian knowledge. Anything that had survived the burning of the libraries at Alexandria could be found there. And that library still exists. Now, I don't know if it has all the same materials or not in it. I would imagine the most scathing or the revealing ones would be locked up somewhere in the Vatican
That's
library.
Right. Yeah.
But the library is actually still there. But then right after that, he went back. He did somewhere in all of that. He before all of that, I think it was before that, he actually fought alongside Joan of Arc. If you can believe that. Mm-hmm. So that places you in time what was going on.
By the way, is there any evidence, in your opinion, that the de Medici family was also of the Ebonite tribe, if you will?
Well, no, I haven't found anything like that. But it wouldn't. I mean, again, it kind of wouldn't surprise me.
Right.
That all of that blood, and this is where it may go too deep for us to get into it, but it does go back through, back down into the Holy Land if you follow it, for hundreds and hundreds of years, and it seems to connect. At least this what the Israelis and scholars in the UK in particular believe. It connects back to the Dan tribe, the Danites,
right?
Who escaped from the Holy Land. They were the lost tribe. They were pushed out by the Assyrians and their homeland, which was essentially where the Phoenicians were centered around Joppa. And they were forced out and forced northward. So they escaped and ended up in Armenia. And from there, the Merovingian, the Frankish kings, came out of that bloodline.
Interesting.
So your tie back to the Holy Land is through the Dan tribe.
Right.
Now, that's not what a lot of people say the royal family is based on. They say it's the Davidic line somehow, that would make them descended from Jesus, you see.
Right, yeah.
Assuming Jesus actually was fathered by a human,
Yeah.
I mean, there's all these assumptions in any of these things.
Of course,
but,
yeah. The mythology around it that they want to try to play on is in line of that thinking in a way. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so it appears that that the typical view is of Rosalind and of the bloodline is that Jesus was a person and Mary Magdalene was a person, and that they had a child, and that bloodline then descended, it floated across the Mediterranean to southern France or around, and that the royal bloodline then is Davidic, and that it came from that. That's the cover story, I believe, for what history tells us the truth is, which is it's probably Danite blood. And see, they were kind of the black sheep of the family when it came to Canaan and what was developing in the Holy Land at that time. They were the ones who most retained sort of the old Babylonian, Sumerian, religions, which was all again based on the sun and Venus.
Okay, because it's very interesting. I just want to kind of listen to you as you continue to unfold and present the material here. In a little bit, though, I want to take a little break here between the segments. We're going to carry on in the next one there for our members. But one thing I wanted to ask you about first here is the idea, obviously, that, well, two things maybe then. There's the idea that Venus is associated with Lucifer, the morning star, the evening star. As you lay this out, as you present this, the rumor that we are having people who are Luciferian worshippers become more real in the sense that more tangible. Correct? Is there anything you can say about that?
Well, the term Lucifer is a Latin word, that means the light bringer, and that's it was a term that was used by Romans and in prior times to identify the morning star or the evening star, which is both Venus. And so it's a reference to really a deification of Venus to some extent. But all the religions prior to Christianity were really, they incorporated some sort of Venusian goddess in some form. In fact, the Hebrews, they had their own goddess of Venus that they eventually suppressed, but it didn't ever go away completely. You can even find it in the Catholic Church, and I'll tell you here in a minute. But in the Hebrew temple, you would have the presence of the divine feminine in a pillar called the Shekinah, but the Shekinah was a pole or a pillar that represented the goddess of Venus, which was named Asherah. Now, Asherah was descended from Ashtaroth and Ashtart, and Ishtar and so forth, going way back into Babylon and ultimately to Sumer, and further back than that. But so the Hebrew temple had a feminine aspect to it that was considered the wife of Yahweh, and that was Venus. Yahweh being essentially a solar deity, and Asherah being the Venus deity. And
this has been hugely suppressed, consequently, obviously. This is not something that has been talked much about. Interesting.
Absolutely. And this Asherah pole, it ultimately became the Christmas tree. Now, because they would bring these poles into the houses, and decorate them and like an altar, and put gifts to the goddess underneath them, and that's really where the Christmas tree came from. Now it has an older lineage than that, but I'm just placing that
right. I mean, even sorry to interrupt. Even the Meru pillar that we talked about before is a kind of a stylized tree in that manner, if you want.
Yes. So you've got this. They eventually replaced the pole with just smoke. it was sort of and that was the Holy Spirit and the Trinity. The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Well, the Holy Spirit is the missing feminine entity, and it was represented once the pole and there were actually in the pole there was carvings of the goddess, and then it just became a pole, and then it just became a pillar of smoke. Well, the pillar of smoke you see today, when they even in the Catholic Church, where they go around with the incense and they're burning the incense. So that smoke is the vestiges of the sacred feminine that was once part of the Hebrew religion.
Very interesting. Yeah. Is there anything else you want to mention about that?
Well, in Rosslyn Chapel, there is a pillar or a pole that it represents a Shira, and they called it the Shekinah, just like the Hebrews. So this is the central pole or pillar at the front or the eastern front side of the chapel, and it's upon that pillar that you have these carvings of the 13, the angels, and the angels are sitting on top of what else but pentagrams carved into the top of the pillar. And then above that are the musical cubes, the resonant cubes that were carved.
Interesting. And there is maybe we can get into that later because I think that's more open. But why don't we talk briefly here, because I do want to mention it in the first segment here before we take a break. We can certainly talk more about it in detail. But tell us about the Venus transit upcoming here very, very soon. And for those people who tune in immediately, if you will, right away into the archives here, will going to be able to look at this or follow it more if you'd like. So tell us what this is, when it is, and if there's anything pertinent about that you'd like to talk about briefly here before we take a break.
Sure.
Richard.
Sure. Okay. So the Venus transit is a very rare conjunction where Venus passes between the Earth and the Sun, and it appears as a black dot going across the Sun. In ancient times, this was known as the Eye of Ra because it looked like an eyeball looking down at Earth.
Right.
Looking across, the all-seeing eye. So, for instance, in Freemasonry, there at the top of their symbolism, you have the all-seeing eye. On the back of a U.S. dollar bill, you've got the all-seeing eye. Well, this is really a reference to not just the sun, but Venus passing in front of the sun. Okay, and in ancient times, this conjunction, what you might call a celestial congress of the Sun and Venus, was a mating, in effect, of these two planets and these two deities, these two spirits that were so important, and they played around with each other in the sky. Venus would rise in the east out of the water before the sun, and it appeared as if it was a torch, and that became the torch of liberty, and it was the morning star, and it would resurrect the sun. So you have this sort of relationship, this feminine fertility relationship of giving birth to a new sun. Well, during a Venus transit, where the Venus passes in front of the sun, in effect, that is kind of a birth of Venus. That's where the Botticelli's Birth of Venus concept came from, where the two mate in the sky and they give birth into the waters of the earth. And so the next one and the last one, and I believe in any of our lifetimes, is about to occur.
That's right. Yep.
And it's going to happen June 5th. It's going to begin on June 5th and end on June 6th. So it will begin to enter the top area of the sun and pass across it during the night of the 5th and then into the morning of the 6th. Well, this is actually discussed quite a bit in the ancient Vedas and the Rig Veda. They described it as, Vena being swallowed, Shukra being swallowed by the sun and then spit out as a seed.
Mm-hmm.
That's the birth of Venus. But it was not just the birth of Venus, it was also the birth of Venus and all her children. And you'll see in any rendering of Venus, you'll see lots of little flying babies. Those were cherubs, or putti is what they're also called. And these flying babies were all the children of Venus, and their leader was Eros, or Cupid. He was the head cherub, and he led them. Well, these carvings, these angels that are in Rosslyn, are essentially the children of Venus. And the interesting thing about that is that they are sort of an anthropomorphization or a personification of an even older idea of Venus fertility, which was that her children were bees. You know, after all, they go around, they fertilize the flowers that we depend upon, the plants that we depend upon, and so they were kind of Venus's emissary on Earth. They were her children. Well, this Venus transit is, in effect, literally the seminal point at which her children are, birthed into the world. This is if you go back to the deepest Vedic cosmology, this is a very key point. You could really say the Venus transit is the moment at which religion was born, the realization that this was going on, and translating it to what was going on Earth. That was the birthing point of religion.
So short note on this, we're not talking about the Velikovskian kind of theory here about the birth of Venus. We're talking about the transit being visible from Earth, that is the symbolic birth of the planet then.
Yes, the original. Now there's been, how many variations on that through different cultures over time. Yeah. It's just, innumerable. But this idea that the Sun and Venus, for instance, appear to come out of the water on the eastern horizon, connects them with this, they were viewed as sort of water deities too. Somehow this fiery ball and this torch, was coming out of the water. And they didn't necessarily have a concept that, no, they're out in space. That's where you get a lot of the idea of mermaids and, fertility symbols associated with it, and fertility gods, like Dagon and Belatu of ancient Sumer, being sea gods. And you get the Merovingians saying that they were born from the Quinatar, which was a sea bull. All of these things relate back to Venus and the Sun, having their celestial mating, and in particular, the Venus transit itself is very, very central to this. And so now, here we've got a very amazing situation about to occur, where Venus is actually in Taurus. Okay, there's your sea bull concept. Right. With Venus has just back on the on the 13th, I believe it was, began its retrograde. So, and it's looping right in between. It loops, every synodic period 5 times during this 8-year period, and this time it's looping right inside between the horns of Taurus. But as it retrogrades and it comes back, and then that's when it passes across the face of the sun. And that's where we are right now, is that it's heading down into the head of the bull of Taurus. And the sun is moving right into where the heart of Taurus is, the heart of the bull. Yeah. And now Venus is going to then pass through the heart of the bull as it crosses the face of Venus. It's an amazing symbolism. Oh yeah. But it's also an ancient, evidence of an ancient awareness and knowledge of this resonance pattern and this idea of harmonics as a universal organizing principle in the cosmos.
We had the prior one, because they always they come in pairs with about 7-8 years in between or so.
8 years. Yes.
8 years, that's right. Okay, so 2004, 8th of June 2004 was the prior one, and then there won't be another one until December 2117. So it's a good chance to see it, to spot it, and to, I guess, experience it, if you can put it that way.
Yes, and you know, my interest in writing this book, as I began to tie the pieces together, was to get it out in time, you know, prior to the Venus transit, so that people could be more appreciative of what this celestial event meant to humanity.
Yeah.
So today is which is May 22nd. It's now available. The book is, and it took a lot of work to get it to come out prior to the transit. And I'm just happy to have been able to do that.
I can imagine you did pull it off. So why don't we talk a little bit about the websites here where people can go to pick up copies of the book if they want to find out more and hear more, and of course tell us your previous book as well, if that's available there right on the website, Richard.
Mm-hmm. Sure. So my website for all of my books and blog and various other articles that I've done is interferencetheory.com, and you'll see on there there's just tons of information, and also a lot of this is inspired in the past has inspired my my artwork, and so there's a little area where there's some artwork as well. But music, once you begin to realize that everything is a manifestation of music, it pretty much pervades everything that you do.
That's right.
But another place that people can go is to discuss the book in particular is on Facebook.com/The Venus Blueprint. And if you go there, you'll see there's quite a few people there, all discussing things that I've posted and that they've posted. And it's just a generally good place to go to sort of get the scoop on what's going on with the transit and sort of the history behind it.
All right, very good. The Venus Blueprint, again, that's the title, and the website's interferencetheory.com. And also check out facebook.com/The Venus Blueprint. We're going to have these links up, of course, on redicecreations.com as well, for ease to just click through. I think we should take a little break here then, Richard, and then come back here with more, because this is very, very interesting. I like listening to this, and much more to discuss and touch upon. So we'll be right back. In the second hour with Richard Merrick, we continue to discuss the Venus Blueprint in more detail, and we go really into some of the specifics. How was this pentagonal pattern created by Venus seen or known by the ancient people? We go into more detail on the purpose of the temples and the connection to the entheogenic component. The temples, or the psychoacoustical chambers, creates an altered or heightened state of consciousness that was used in unison with psychoactive substances. This is a fascinating continuation that you shouldn't miss. To listen to the second hour, you need a membership to listen. This is how we continue to produce material. It is listener supported, and we spare you from commercial breaks and a website full of blinking banners. There is so much good stuff in our member section, so if you haven't already signed up for a membership, try it out. It's not much money, only €5 per month. That's like 2 lattes here in Sweden, or about the price of a beer if you go out. So why not encourage those brain cells to grow? Instead, we have a 3-month recurring option for you, or a one-time payment going from 3 months up to 2 years. All the information is on redicecreations.com. Some of our upcoming guests on Red Ice Radio includes Dean Clifford, John B. Wells, Neil Kramer, Peter Haldursson, Nora Gedgaudas, Richard Grove, Britt D. and Tom Secker, Winter Lake, Alex Newman, Eric Karlström, Janice Barcelo, Brunvalo Melchizedek, and Jordan Maxwell. We hope to have you with us soon again, but right now we are going to continue with our second hour with Richard Merrick.